My name is Roberta. My name is Roberta Ferrario. I have to accept the recording, sorry. Okay. My name is Roberta Ferrario, and I work at the Laboratory for Applied Ontology in Trento since I think more than 20 years now. And I'm presenting today a work that dated back to 2018. I think I presented it for the first time at the FOIS 2018 in Cape Town. This is a kind of simplified version and a shorter version, obviously, and without formulas. So let's say more open to discussion, to philosophical discussion than what was intended back in 2018. After FOIS, we also worked on the subject for a couple of years more when I was doing a visiting scholar, when I received a visiting scholarship at the University of Leeds. So there have been some advancements since the first, let's say, presentation at FOIS, but still it's work in progress. I think it's an interesting topic. And let's say that I won't spend much time in justifying the importance of doing ontology of organization because I don't have time today, but believe me, it's important. If you have to model processes in industry or in healthcare systems, but even if you have to model, let's say, social interaction, the idea of having a way to characterize organizations both in a static and in a dynamic way, I think it's very central. So the idea behind this work is that there is a theory in philosophy that was put forward by Kit Fine back in the 90s. I mean, I think the first work presenting it was in 1999, I think, was the paper titled The Things and Their Part. Then Kit Fine has worked for years on the topic. And I think that this theory is, let's say, adaptable to the case of organizations, making some changes. And I will try to show how the changes we are proposing to the theory, to the original theory. So, sorry. So the main point in applying this Kit Fine's proposal is that of trying to characterize the problem of persistence of organizations through time. And let's say that in the multidisciplinary domain, so both in economics and in sociology and also in computer science, usually organizations are studied along two different, let's say, perspectives. We can call structural and concrete. I mean, this is very rough account. The idea is that you have both, let's say, static properties that you want to describe, but also dynamic properties and, let's say, an embodied perspective that you want to render when you characterize organization. And let's say the former is more concerned with structural characterization, while the latter, the dynamic dimension, is more concerned, obviously, with change. And the idea is that we need a criterion enabling the re-identification of organization through time and obviously through change, because organizations, as we know them, they continually evolve. And the focus of this talk is on structured and formal and official organizations, but that's simply because it's easier to characterize them, because, let's say, things are rendered in a more explicit way. But the idea is to apply this approach also to informal groups. So the thing that we want to represent when we think about organizations at a given time is that we want to represent all the aspects, the structural and the concrete ones, of the elements composing an organization at a given point in time. For instance, we can call this T. So some of the things that we want to represent are the purpose of the organization at T, the tasks that the organization carry out to reach this purpose, the structuration of the organization. So how simple and complex roles, with complex roles here I mean sub-organizations, how these are, let's say, described, which are the agents playing the roles and the agents constituting the sub-organizations, which are the norms that define how the powers acquired by the roles, for instance, the duties acquired by the roles, and how these, let's say, abstract duties and powers transform into a behavior that is the behavior of the player of the role, and how these norms serve to regulate their behaviors. So among the norms, we can have membership norms, decision procedures, meta norms, so norms that explain how to change the norms, And also relations between the different roles of the organization. So those defining the structure of the organization, relations between the roles and their players, what in literature is called the classification relation, and relations between norms and roles. So not the norms that define the roles, for instance. And we want to be able to characterize these at a given time. But we also want to characterize how these things can change through time. So the changes that can affect an organization through time are many. So we can have addition, expulsion, or a change of players of a certain role. So for instance, in work organization, we can hire or fire people in specific roles. But we can also have structural changes in the organization. We can add or eliminate roles in the organization. For instance, when we decide to merge two departments of the same, two departments of a university, for instance, or of a company, or when, for instance, we decide to create a new team to deal with a particular issue that has emerged that the organization wants to deal with. We can have an expansion, restriction, or change of the purpose of the organization. And this is, let's say, less common, but still, I mean, very important. And usually when the purpose changes, also the tasks to attain it change. And we can have a rule change, as I was anticipating. So we can change the requirements and the powers or the duties or the responsibilities connected with a role. We can change the membership rules to join the organization. We can change the decision procedures with which the organization enacts its actions to reach the goals. We can change the secondary rules and so on and so forth. So as I was saying, we got inspired by this theory proposed by Kit Fine back in 1999. And strangely enough, I mean, I presented for the first time before FOIS in 2018 this approach at a philosophy conference where also Kit Fine was invited. And at the same conference, he presented its application of the theory of a rigid and variable embodiment to social groups. So we were, let's say, doing the same thing at the same time, more or less. And so a lot of discussions were born since that day. And it was really interesting. But I would say that we have a very similar account, but with some differences that I will try to explain. So back in 1999, Kit Fine presented the theory to explain how material things are composed. So partwood in material things. And he wanted to characterize temporary partwood and, let's say, atemporal partwood. And he used the theory of rigid embodiments to characterize timeless partwood, while he used the notion of variable embodiment to talk about temporalized partwood. So starting from the rigid embodiment, the idea was to characterize a whole like something composed of elements, and that here we can see in the formula called with the letters A, B, C, and a relation keeping these elements, these components together. And here for relation, the relation is characterized with the letter R. We mean also a complex relation. So for instance, if you think about the idea of organization, complex relations holding between all the components. So the example with which Kit Fine presented his approach is that of a sandwich in which you have components. There are two slices of bread and a slice of ham, but also a particular way in which these components are arranged. And this is the relation R in Fine's account. He presented an existent postulate saying that the rigid embodiment exists at a time if and only if the relation R holds of the elements A, B, C at this time T. And he also presented an identity postulate saying that two rigid embodiments, A, B, C / R and A prime, B prime, C prime / R prime are the same if and only if the state of the components standing in the relation R is the same as the state of the other components, the A prime, B prime, C prime, standing in the relation R prime. So let's say it's very simple from a, let's say, logical point of view. And coming to variable embodiments, to describe variable embodiments, Fine used the example of a river and saying that we are not only interested in knowing which parts of, let's say, water compose the river at a certain point in time, but we also want to talk about all the water going through the river at all time. So he introduced this problem with this principle of variable embodiment. That is a principle that picks up at every moment in time a rigid embodiment, which is a manifestation. So for instance, in the case of the river, the principle, let's say, of variable embodiment of the river picks up at every moment t, let's say, a snapshot of the water composed in the river at that time t. So this snapshot is called the manifestation of the variable embodiment at t. So if f is a variable embodiment, and so the small f represents the variable embodiment and the big F represents the principle of a variable embodiment, we shall use ft, so an indexed f, for the object selected by the principle at time t, that is for the manifestation of the variable embodiment f at time t. And in this case, it's presented an existence postulate and an identity postulate. The existence postulate states that the variable embodiment f exists at time t if and only if it has a manifestation at the time t. And on the other hand, the identity postulate or two variable embodiments f and g, these are the same if and only if their principles f and g are the same. So any manifestation of a variable embodiment at a given time is a temporary part of the variable embodiment at that time. So this is the theory really in a nutshell. And now we'll try to see how we can try to apply them to the case of our organizations. So let's start with organizations at a time and rigid embodiments. So if we take the rigid embodiment E given by the components A, B, C, and the relation R, if we take this as the manifestation of an organization at T, we can see the elements of the organization, so the A, B, and C, both the structural and the concrete elements, as the components of the rigid embodiment. So in the case of if we see the organization at time t as a rigid embodiment, we can see the components like physical agents, the role players, the roles, the purpose, the tasks, the rules, the buildings in which the organization, for instance, has its premises, the devices used by the organization, etc. We can see all these as the components of the rigid embodiment. And all these components are taken together by different relations that all together form a kind of pattern of relations. And we can see this pattern of relations as the relational principle R, the one characterized by Kitt-Fine for the rigid embodiments. So at different times, either some or all of the constituents, or also the pattern of the relations, or both, so both the constituents and the pattern of relations can vary. And this is what's gives rise to the variable embodiment. And in our case, we want to see whether the notion of variable embodiment can be used to characterize organizational change. So we can take two rigid embodiments, E and E prime, at a certain time. And as we have seen for the case of rigid embodiments, the elements of these two rigid embodiments are persons, roles, norms, in our case, connected by a pattern of relations. And how can we say if these two rigid embodiments are manifestations of the same organization? This is the questions we tried to answer. So Kitt-Fine would say, if there is a principle F that picks up both E and E prime, if this principle F picks up these two rigid embodiments as manifestations of a variable embodiment, we can have a variable embodiment of which E and E prime are manifestations. But then we asked ourselves, what is this principle F? Because it's not straightforward to think about a principle that is only, let's say, connected with the evolution of time. Maybe we should just look for some criteria for re-identifying organizations. And these criteria for identifying, for instance, E and E prime as manifestations of the same organization, maybe they should have something in common, some structural similarities, some common foundational aspects. So what is that characterizes the way in which organizations at a time are picked up by this principle of variable embodiment? And this is something that is not answered by Kitt-Fine, not even in the most recent paper I'm aware of, which is the one of 2020 that is called The Identity of Social Group, because in his account, the whole issue of persistence of complex entities, so including organizations and the social groups, but not only. So all this persistence principle is encapsulated in the functional principle of variable embodiment. but this principle is never detailed. I mean, it's like a kind of black box. So we wanted to inquire whether there is something that we should look at to, let's say, characterize this principle for the case of organizations. And what we thought about is the decisional history of organization. So let's try to explain this a bit quickly, but as clearly as possible. So the question is, are there some constraints that E and E prime, so the manifestations, the rigid embodiments must satisfy to be the manifestations of the same organization at two successive points in time? So the principle of variable embodiment F can only pick up at t+1, so at a certain point in time, a rigid embodiment E prime, which is consistent. So not whatever rigid embodiment you have at t+1, but something which is consistent with how E, so the other rigid embodiment, was at t, so in a previous moment. And we want to pick up these two rigid embodiments just in case the changes determined by the actions performed by the organization at time t, so when E was the manifestation of the organization, allow this E to evolve from t to t+1 to become E prime. So we want to preserve this consistency principle, let's say, to pass from t to t+1 in order to be able to say that these two rigid embodiments are manifestations of the same organization, so the same variable embodiment. And this is because the state of the organization at t+1, so let's say the successive moment, depends on the state of the organization at t, but it's not completely determined by it. So it's not just the flowing of time that makes, let's say, the variable organization turn from E to E prime. We want to constrain the principle F in such a way that these two manifestations are connected by something that has a sense for the organization. So we propose that what reconstructs the trajectory, let's say, that through time of the organization is the history of the decisions taken by the organization.
70 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Frank. And I just have the last slide, so I've been good enough, let's say. So as in Pine's theory, we assume that there is a principle that allows to pick up states of the organization that correspond to manifestations of the same organization at different points in time. But in addition to the proposal of Fine, we have also proposed that the decisional history is what glues together the different states of an organization. So we want to make sure that the organization as it is at t+1 is consistent with the decisions that have been taken by the organization at t, and the decisions that have been taken by, let's say, the persons playing the right roles to take these decisions. So everything is kept together by this decisional history. So consequently, in an organization, everything can change, both the components and the relations between the components, provided that these changes happen on the basis of the powers that the organization has at a certain time. So the right persons, let's say, take legitimately the decisions on behalf of the organization. So also actions and decisions are fundamental elements for the organizational identity. So to understand what the organization is at a certain point in time and through the flowing of time. So if you're interested, I will leave you the slides at the end of the talk so that you can have some references of some works of Kit Fine on this theory, and also a couple of works that we have done in our group concerning rigid and variable embodiment. Thanks for the attention, and sorry for the 2 minutes, 2 additional minutes I took.